Hi, I'm Todd Mahan, Executive Director at the Anoka County Historical Society, and welcome to the May 2014 edition of It's Your History. This is a joint production between the Anoka County Historical Society and QCTV. We've got a terrific episode coming up for you this month. We're going to be focusing on more Civil War history in Anoka County. We're going to be visiting with Vicki Window, Program Manager at the Historical Society, talking about Aaron Greenwald, the first volunteer for the Union Army. We're going to be visiting with author Wayne Jorgensen, who came to the History Center to do a presentation on his book about the 1st Minnesota, that epic unit that served with the Union Army and fought in many epic battles in the Civil War. And then we're going to be stopping at some other sites around the county that have a lot to do with Anoka County Civil War history, including Woodbury Park in St. Francis, and going down to Columbia Heights to the site of the location of the fire that burned up Abraham Lincoln's funeral car. So we've got a great episode coming up for you. Stay tuned. I'm standing here at the corner of Ferry and Main in Anoka at the site of the Schuler Building, where in 1861, several volunteers, including Aaron Greenwald, were the first volunteers for the Union Army. When a court case was being held in the Schuler Building, a recess was called to call for volunteers. Aaron Greenwald and several others raised their hand and volunteered. And we're going to talk to Vicki Window at the Anoka County History Center for more details on that terrific story. Well, we're here in the Anoka County History Center in our Civil War exhibit, and we're going to be talking with Vicki Window, the program manager, who's also the curator of this exhibit, and she's also a nationwide expert on Aaron Greenwald and those first volunteers of the Union Army. And so we're going to turn over to Vicki and ask her a couple of questions about where we just were on the corner of Ferry and Main in Anoka. So Vicki, the first volunteers for the Union Army, specifically Aaron Greenwald, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, you have to have a little bit of background first. You see, when the Union Army was formed, it was in the planning stages in April of 1861 when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. The standing U.S. Army at that point was only between 15 and 16,000 men, and they're scattered all over the country, so there wasn't an army to defend Washington. The Confederates were raising an army. Lincoln knew this, so the plans were all in place to raise an army, of a volunteer army. So when Fort Sumter was fired on, our governor, Alexander Ramsey, was at Washington, and he decided it would be a good PR move for this brand new state of Minnesota, we'd only been a state for 3 years, to offer the first troops for the Union Army. So he went to the Secretary of War and offered 1,000 men from Minnesota to put down this terrible rebellion. Well, of course, they had already planned this. They were going to need 75,000, so they said, sure, we'll take them. Put it in writing. Ramsey did. Immediately sent a telegram back to Minnesota, and of course he sent it to one of his political friends, Willis Gorman. Gorman's out in Anoka, and he's doing, he's a lawyer, he's doing a case with a man who was accused of stealing 10 bushels of cranberries and a mattress out on Lake George, and he was involved with that case here. So the telegram had to come by horseback from St. Paul to Anoka because we don't have a telegraph line yet. Mm-hmm. And when it arrived here, Gorman stood up, called for a recess in the court, and asked for volunteers. And that's how Anoka got to have the very first volunteers.
And so Aaron Greenwald is considered to be the first one. How do we know that Aaron was there in the courtroom?
Because of the court records, we know Aaron was involved he was in the courtroom. We're not sure how if he was a witness, or if he was on the jury, or he was just a spectator. We're not sure, but we know because of court records he was in the courtroom, and he was the first one to say, yes, I will go to defend the Union.
And what day is this?
This was the morning of April 14th.
April 14th, so 1861. Now, I got to stop you and ask you a question. I live in St. Paul, and went to school in St. Paul, and there at the between the St. Paul Cathedral and the Minnesota History Center on the Greenway down to the state capitol is a very tall, very prominent statue that is remembering the first man to volunteer for the Union Army. And if you look closely at it, and you don't have to look too closely, it doesn't say Aaron Greenwald on there. It
no,
says Josiah King. What's the deal?
Well, in Anoka, we're not going to give up Aaron. However, we've got good argument for it. The court cases at this time were generally daytime things, and we know that when Josiah King enlisted, he was the first man to put his name on the enlistment form from the St. Paul Militia Company that was already in existence. They enlisted as a group. The first guy to put his name down on that list was Josiah King. So therefore, he's the first one of that first company. That first company was Company A. Aaron Greenwald and the other men who enlisted here, there was only 7 of them, didn't have enough for a whole company. A company is 100 men. So when they got to St. Paul a couple of days later, because these guys stayed home here and took a couple days to get their affairs in order before they marched off to war, they had to be plugged into what ever company needed a guy or two. So some of our guys ended up scattered throughout the entire 1st Minnesota Infantry through all the companies. Aaron ended up in Company C. And because of this and this day or two of waiting, and at the time, nobody cared who was first. It wasn't written down in the papers or anything else. Nobody cared. They were all enthused to get off to the war. So it wasn't until many, many years after the war that anybody tried to figure out who was who. And by this time, well, Aaron was killed at Gettysburg. So he wasn't around to say anything.
So Josiah King, Aaron Greenwald, and perhaps others, they all have their claim to the first. I mean, it kind of maybe depends on how you want to define the first, but regardless of that, in some ways it's an insignificant point. They all served,
yes,
and they all certainly participate. Aaron King survives the war, in that way sometimes he's able to claim that mantle of the first, and then Aaron, of course, perished at Gettysburg, and so he didn't live to sort of tell his part of the story.
Right. It was his son that was the one who told Aaron's story and really brought it to the forefront. He and a guy by the name of Alva Eastman from, actually at that time St. Cloud, but he had been in Anoka and worked at the newspapers. And he claimed to have had the written proof that Aaron was first by several hours. It never surfaced. Nobody's ever seen those papers that say that Aaron was really the first, because he enlisted early in the day where Josiah King didn't enlist till late in the evening. We don't know. We never will.
It makes me wonder that if Aaron in his lifetime ever considered himself to be the first, and on those long marches that the 1st Minnesota ever took, if King and Greenwald ever got into barbs over who was first or whatever, and maybe they'd even chose sides then. I doubt it very much.
I do too, but it sure would be fun to think about.
All right, well, thanks for all the time on this, Vicki, and we'll be right back after this.
For more than 60 years, I've been a member of the country's oldest charity, dedicated to the welfare of children and animals, the American Humane Association. Won't you help transform our world? Just 60 cents a day, and you can make a difference for children and animals across America. Please, become a member. Visit AmericanHumane.org today.
I am standing in St. Francis on the northern part of Anoka County in Woodbury Park, a beautiful park in the town center square of St. Francis. Park named for Albert Woodbury, one of Anoka County's prominent citizens and a Civil War veteran. Albert first came to Anoka in 1853 and was very taken with the area. He liked the possibilities here. He liked the Rum River and the possibility of the use of the river for milling and things like that. And so Albert was very interested in purchasing the water power rights along the Rum River. And he was writing back to his family and telling them all about the opportunities in Anoka County, in St. Francis and Anoka. And so his father came and joined him, and his brothers came and joined him, and they became very much known as entrepreneurs in the area and helped settle and develop the area. And then when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Albert became very interested in helping to raise men to volunteer for that effort. And so he turned over the business operations to his brother Charles, and Albert wanted to help recruit men for that first wave of volunteers in April of 1861, what would become the 1st Minnesota. But people were very excited to volunteer at that point, and so it wasn't really needed. And so he didn't become involved in recruiting until more of January and February of 1862, after he'd made the acquaintance of William Hotchkiss. Hotchkiss wanted to raise an artillery unit. He wanted to raise people that were firing the cannons. And so he and Woodbury recruited men for what would become the 2nd Battery of Light Artillery that served in the Civil War. And Hotchkiss became the captain, and Woodbury became second in command and was the 2nd lieutenant. And so they got their first baptism by fire, the 2nd Battery did, at the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky. And they performed well there, and they continued to perform well throughout the war. Woodbury actually found himself in command of the unit at the Battle of Chickamauga. Hotchkiss was off on a special detail, and so Woodbury was commanding the troops in that battle. And he was wounded at that battle and ended up dying from those wounds about a month later. Now, the newspapers of the area wrote very maudlin stories about his death, and it was a particularly painful death in that the first reports came back that he had been wounded but was expected to survive those wounds. And so when they found out that he did die, it hit the community particularly hard. And so he is still very much remembered to this day, and with the naming of the Woodbury Park, and is one of Anoka County's many Civil War veterans. And now we're going to join a program in progress with author Wayne Jorgensen, who came to the Anoka County History Center and spoke about his book on the 1st Minnesota.
So this book is stories about the men. Remember, these are men who were rugged pioneers. And here's what a Chicago Tribune reporter had to say. There are few regiments we have seen that can compare to the brawn and muscle of these Minnesotians. Used to the axe, the rifle, the oar, and the setting pole, they are unquestionably the finest body of troops that have yet appeared in our streets. Now that's pretty impressive. What comes to my mind is, what do you suppose the Illinois troops thought when they read this? But they were a fine-looking body of troops. They had some tall men. William Colville, remember, was 6'5". Captain Mark Downey, who commanded the Lumberjacks of Company B from Stillwater, was 6'4". There were several men who were 6'2" and 6'1". We maybe think that's a little high, but remember the average height of a Civil War soldier was 5'8". So we're a little taller now. So they had a lot of tall men, but I think they probably marched with a little bit of strength and belief that they were all right. Here's what another man had to say after the war about the 1st Minnesota. This man, Colonel Charles Devins, commanded the 15th Massachusetts, and he wrote, "I remember that my regiment and one from Minnesota were ordered to build a road, and I found that the Minnesota regiment, composed as it was in the main part of men accustomed to wielding an axe, were doing more wood chopping in one day than my regiment was in 2. In speaking of the manner that the Minnesota men felled the trees, he said that they were a regiment of large men who swung the axe breast high and cut the trees nearly through and left them standing just ready to fall. They would begin on one side and work their way through a lot, and on reaching the other side would fall the outer trees inward, and these would communicate their fall to the adjoining trees, and so on, the whole forest falling together." He also said the 1st Minnesota were great fighters as well as wood choppers. Do you know the story of Gettysburg? And, well, you know that there was a charge. Okay. On the left side, there's a fish hook, and on the long part of the shank, down the left side, General Sickles had been commanded to hold that area against any attack. Just hold that line. We needed to be defensive and hold. Well, Sickles was the highest ranking politically appointed general and a real strong egotist. He thought he saw an advantage if he moved his men to higher ground, a little out in the open area, that he would have a good advantage on the Confederates there. So he advanced his men without orders. Unfortunately, that left a big gap in the line, and Longstreet, who was a superior general, said, "Oh, I like this." And Longstreet's men just mowed over Sickles' men and pushed them back, and they retreated. Well, they advanced to the rear very quickly is what they did. So they're running through, and now there is no 3rd Corps covering a space about a half mile wide. Hancock comes up and sees this hole, and he sees part of the Confederate troops have now moved over to this area, and they're coming in here, which is going to be difficult for the Union Army if they get there. This is the 12th, 14th, and 10th Alabama Regiment, roughly 15, maybe 1,800 men. They're coming. There's nobody there except the 1st Minnesota. The 1st Minnesota was being held in reserve. By that time, and this is from Chris Heffelfinger's memoirs, Tom Heffelfinger's grandfather, great-grandfather, by that time of the war, he said that veteran troops that could really be counted on were not put in the front lines. They were held in reserve. If you did the other, put your green troops in the back, if you advanced your veterans and they had to fall back for whatever reason, the green troops would not stand. They would run. So you kept your veterans in the back, you moved your green troops forward, and if they fell back, you knew you had your veterans who would hold your line. So the 1st Minnesota was being held in reserve guarding an artillery battery. Hancock rides up. He sees that there's about a half-mile wide gap. He sees this small band of about 262 men. He turns to the colonel and he says, "What regiment is this?" The colonel says, "The 1st Minnesota." And he says, "Charge those colors." And the men knew what they had to do, so they fixed bayonets and they went forward. Now, why would Hancock order men into that type of attack? 262 against 1,500. If you're one of the 262, you know the odds are not very good for your survival. He had to do that because if the Confederates came through, there were Union troops further over here and Union troops over here. But there was a danger that if the Confederates came through, they would start here and they would peel both directions and they would roll up the Union line. So let me explain what rolling up is. You see those men? They are standing too deep. There are 2 rows of roughly 130 men. And so if you've got 130 men pointing their rifles here, and then the man right behind him on his shoulder, and then there's another, and there's 129 more this way, another 129 more this way, and you're all firing, that's a lot of lead going that direction to help stop an advance. But let's say the 1st Minnesota wasn't there, and they got in this way, and they start turning this way and that way. And so now, rather than, if I'm one of the regiments over here, and I'm pointing this way, but the Confederates have come on my flank, what have they got to shoot at? 2 men. Me and my file mate behind me. And when we go down, it's the next 2 men in line. All they have to shoot is 2 men at a time. And pretty soon, after 3 or 4 of these dropping, if I'm standing here and I'm watching this happen, now I'm advancing to the rear. And the whole Union line would retreat. So that is called rolling up. Rather than firing at 1,000 rifles, get on the side and fire at 2 at a time. That's how Sergeant York captured a big German position in World War I. He came from the side and started picking them off. And eventually they all surrendered. So, to prevent that, Hancock said, "Charge those colors." He had called for troops to come up, but he knew it would take 15 to 20 minutes at least. So he charged the men in. 262 started from the top of the hill. Have any of you been to Gettysburg? Have you seen the monument? Okay, that's where they started. And you've seen Plum Run? By the way, they've fixed up Plum Run. All the trees that you've seen, they're all gone. It now looks like this. They started from where the monument is, where the soldier is facing, and they went in. 20 minutes later, they were ordered back out. 47 were left. What we had going on here, you start out with Color Sergeant Elliott Perkins. Back then, they did indeed try to capture the flag. You've heard of the game. Well, they actually did try to do that throughout the Napoleonic Wars. There's great patriotism towards your flag, your national flag. So the enemy would try to shoot the color bearer and get the flag to fall, because then somebody would try to pick it up and carry it forward. But if it was in danger of being captured or not supported, the regiment would falter and stop and wait for the flag to advance, or that was the danger. So they would fire at the color bearer when they could to try to stop the flag. Perkins advances. He is shot in the knee and he goes down. There are 4 color bearers in the color guard that day. Corporal Tom Nasson picks up the flag and he moves forward until he is shot in the chest and he goes down. Finally, Ed Stevens grabs the flag and he holds it through the entire charge until he goes down with 7 bullet wounds and he collapses. Corporal Charles Den, the last of the color bearers, grabs and holds the flag and is one of the 47 to retreat back when they are ordered back. May 29th of 1862, we've got the Union Army on half the Union Army on one side of the Chickahominy River, The other part of the Army has crossed over to escape the Confederates that are moving forward, but the rains have swollen the river to the point where the rushing water has now washed away the bridges, and we're in danger of having the rest of the Union Army pinned on the other side and captured by the Confederates. What are we going to do? Well, the generals called up the Corps of Engineers, whose job it is to build bridges. My father was in the Corps of Engineers, World War II. I learned my rope tying, knot tying from him. And the Corps of Engineers said, it can't be done. You cannot build a bridge with these kind of currents. They'll wash away. General Sully, who had been the second colonel of the 1st Minnesota, Gorman was promoted to brigadier general. They brought in Colonel Sully, another Mexican War veteran. He gets promoted to brigadier general. He's now a general on the staff, and he calls Mark Downey, the captain of the Stillwater Boys, the lumberjacks, tells him what we need. And Mark Downey says, General, give me 1,000 men from the Northwest and we'll build this bridge, meaning give me the 1st Minnesota. So the general puts out orders and they call all the men in from all their details, because some are detailed in hospitals and different places, printing, they're at headquarters or all over. They get together, they look at the lay of the river, what's going on, look at the land, and it is Mark Downey who comes up with the idea to take the grapevines that are hanging down from the trees and use them to lash together the logs so that they will have some play and still have strength. Now, other regiments also were commanded to build bridges, and they did. And because of the raging river, every bridge washed away, except the 1st Minnesota's bridge, which came to be known as the Grapevine Bridge. And it is across this bridge that the rest of the Union Army traveled and escaped capture by the Confederates. There were 1,025 men mustered in 1861. Another 200 were brought in as replacements. So 1,225 men served during the 3 years of existence of the 1st Minnesota. When they were mustered out in May of 1864, there were 300 left. The rest were all either discharged for disability or had died of wounds. I wrote the book out of respect and in honor of these fellows and what they did.
You know, another great connection that Anoka County has to the Civil War, and kind of a fun story, is the story of the Lincoln funeral car. When President Lincoln died in April of 1865, it was just a matter of weeks after the Civil War. And when he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, they had his funeral in Washington, D.C., and then the burial actually took place in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. And they took him by train car from Washington to Springfield. Now, the train car that they used was actually a train car that was supposed to be used by the president during his lifetime, during his presidency. It was essentially the Air Force One of the day. It certainly would have taken him around the country. And a well-appointed car with lots of great upholstery and fine woodwork and all of that. And so instead, it was the car that brought Lincoln from Washington, D.C. to his burial place in Springfield. And so as the train car crossed the country, thousands would turn out as it passed through their town, and they would pay their respects and they would grieve for the president. Now, after his burial, the train car itself was then owned by some of the railroad executives in the country, and they used it for their own purposes, or a traveling car and those types of things. And eventually it came into the hands of Thomas Lowry. Now, Thomas Lowry is a name that many of you probably recognize around the Twin Cities. Lowry Hill in Minneapolis is named for him, and he had a great deal to do with the development of southern Anoka County, particularly what is today Columbia Heights. Lowry was the guy that started the streetcars in Minneapolis, and so he had land in Columbia Heights, and he wanted to sell that land so people could buy their houses. Then they would then use Thomas Lowry's streetcar line to take it into Minneapolis for their to work and all of that. And so he was a businessman. And at some point he got the possession of the Lincoln car too, and he used this car as a sales office for those lots that he was selling in Columbia Heights. It was sat at the corner of what is today 37th and Quincy. At the time, it was an open field because he was selling those lots off for people to use as houses. And nobody knows exactly what he wanted to do with the train car after that, and some speculated that he wanted to use it as a tourist attraction to get people from Minneapolis to take the train car up north into Columbia Heights and have a place to go to a park, which he did set aside land for a park, and that could be a possible use for it as well. But we certainly know that it was used as a sales office. Lowry died in 1909, and 2 years after that, the car was still owned by the company, and they're still selling the lots off. and it was lost in a fire. A fire started on that open field that it was in, and there was nobody around to put out the fire. Well, there were some people around. There's said to be a fire bucket brigade of women and children, and the newspapers report about the children's faces being blistered by the heat of the fire and all that. So lots of sort of very telling stories about that. And so it's lost in the fire, and much of it's wood, but certainly a lot of it is metal. And so it's left over as a pile of metal and some burnt up wood. And people certainly knew that it was the Lincoln train car. And so the salvage people and the scavengers come and they're taking bits and pieces of it. And nobody really knows how many pieces are out there. And here at the Anoka County Historical Society, though, we do have one piece of that train car here, and it was taken by a guy by the name of Woost, who was from the city of Anoka, and then he eventually gave it to his friend Charlie Sell, who was a longtime volunteer at the Anoka County Historical Society, and Charlie gave it to the Historical Society a couple of years ago before he passed away. And so it's one of those pieces that Anoka County has that's a great connection to Abraham Lincoln and, of course, to the story of the Civil War. And we'll have more about Anoka County and the Civil War after this.
For the past 40 years, Anoka Champlin Meals on Wheels has provided a noontime meal and a wellness check-in for our neighbors in need throughout our community. We've been excited that on that first day when we provided 12 meals, up to today where we provide 100 to 110 meals, that we're able to help those people in need get that meal and that daily connection with somebody in our community. As an organization, we want to create and give the community the greatest impact that we possibly can. And because of that, we're looking at a new program called Family Aging Education, getting adult children with their aging parents together to talk about that aging process. And with that new programming, we are now moving to a new name called Impact Services.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this month's edition of It's Your History, but before we go, I want to talk about some of the upcoming events with the Anoka County Historical Society. It's only May, but if you believe it or not, it's ghost tour season again. Of course, we're busiest in September and October, but you can take a ghost tour in the spring and summer as well. We've got ghost tours happening in May, on May 8th, 10th, 22nd, and 24th, and they leave at 7:30 in the afternoon. And they're about an hour-long walking tour of the downtown Anoka area and some of the residential neighborhoods around it. They're fun tours. I like to call them about 60% history and 40% unexplained tales. And it's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to sort of get your history in and some fun as well. And so those tours cost $7 for non-members and $5 for ACH members and for kids. And you can sign up for those tours online by visiting our website at anokacountyhistory.org. We've got lots of other events coming up in May and June. On Thursday, May 1st, we're having our final Civil War lecture series, and we're going to have Michael Ritchie, who is going to be talking about Civil War arms. That is the final of our Civil War lecture series, and that's going to be on Thursday, May 1st here at the Anoka County History Center, and it's going to be at 7 o'clock in the evening, and that is a free event. Some of you might remember we had Michael talking about small arms of the Civil War on It's Your History maybe about a year and a half ago. And then we've got a library program on Saturday, May 3rd at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's going to be our program, Rum Runners and Temperance Tantrums. And that's all the story about bootlegging in Anoka County. Lots of great fun stories. And that's going to be in St. Francis at the Rum River North Park Shelter. For more information about that, visit our website or visit the Anoka County Library's website. And then we've got a Civil War bus tour. Some of the sites that we talked about today are places that you will be visiting on the Civil War bus tour, and that's going to be on Saturday, May 10th. And that's going to run, we're going to meet here at the History Center at 9:30, and we'll get on the bus, and there'll be lunch included with it. And I'll come back here to the History Center at about 2:30 in the afternoon, and then you'll have the opportunity to tour the gallery. That's included as part of the admission price, and you can check out our terrific Civil War exhibit to tie in with everything that you saw on the bus tour earlier that day. And so that is a cost of $35 for non-members and $30 for members. It's almost sold out, so make sure you get onto the website and sign up for that. And then we've got an author reading in June, on Thursday, June 19th at 7 o'clock in the evening. We're going to have author Michael Ressman, who's going to be coming and talking about his book, Asylums, Treatment Centers, and Genetic Jails, a history of Minnesota State Hospitals. That's going to be a free event, and as many of you know, we've been doing quite a bit of history on the Anoka State Hospital lately, and so I'm very excited to see what Michael has to say, and I think it'll be a great event as well. And then last of all, we've got in July our Anoka Heritage Home and Garden Tour. That's coming up on Sunday, July 13th from 1 to 5. Don't forget, it sold out last year, so make sure you get your tickets. Those will be available sometime in June, and it'll be $12 in advance and $15 on the day of. Terrific event. Probably my favorite event that we do all year is the Home and Garden Tour. You get to tour inside and outside of homes and residences in the Anoka area, and we put together a great ticket booklet that tells you all about the history. So if you love the history, I hope that you love this show as well, and we'll see you next month on It's Your History.